When I was 16, I had to stay late after school one winter night to finish a project. It wasn't uncommon for kids to hang around after hours, especially during crunch time. But this night, it was different. It still sends shivers down my spine just thinking about it. It started innocently enough. I was in the art room, a cozy corner of the school tucked away near the back hallways. The old radiator clanked sporadically, trying and failing to keep the room warm. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. The building was eerily quiet, save for the occasional echo of footsteps down distant halls, probably the janitor making his rounds. I was working on a clay sculpture, my hands numb from both the cold and my exhaustion. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second feeling heavier than the last. I glanced at my phone, 7:45 p.m. I told myself I'd pack up by 8. That's when I heard it. A faint laugh. At first I thought it was coming from outside, maybe some kids messing around in the snow. But then it happened again, louder this time. It wasn't a playful laugh, it was high-pitched and shrill, almost manic. My stomach dropped. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the tiled walls. No response. I told myself it was probably just another student staying late, maybe someone fooling around. But as I looked out into the hallway, it was empty. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as I moved. Shrugging it off, I went back to my project, determined to finish quickly and get out of there. But then the laugh came again, closer this time. My hands froze mid-sculpt. This wasn't normal. I got up and peered out into the hallway again. This time I noticed something. Down at the far end of the corridor, where the lights barely reached, there was a figure. It stood motionless, just at the edge of the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but whoever or whatever it was didn't move. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. The figure didn't even flinch. It was like it was waiting. I stepped back into the art room, grabbed my bag, and started packing up. Whatever was going on, I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I slung my bag over my shoulder and turned to leave, I froze. The figure was now at the doorway, just standing there. It was a girl, or at least it looked like one. She was wearing a thin white dress, completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. Her hair was long and matted, partially covering her face, but it was her eyes that terrified me the most. They were wide, unblinking, and locked directly on me. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying an unnatural weight. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. "Who are you? What do you want?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. I bolted past her, adrenaline taking over. As I ran down the hallway, I swear I could hear her laughter following me, growing louder and more distorted. When I reached the main doors, they wouldn't budge. Locked. Panic set in as I fumbled with the lock, but it wouldn't give. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from behind me. I turned around and there she was, standing at the far end of the foyer. She tilted her head, almost curiously, before raising a hand and pointing at me. That's when the lights in the entire building went out. In the pitch darkness, I could hear her footsteps growing closer. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I fumbled for my phone. The dim light of the screen was enough to guide me back toward the art room, where I knew there was a side exit. My hands shook as I felt along the walls, every creak and groan of the old building amplified tenfold. I reached the door and shoved it open, stumbling out into the icy night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I ran to my car, not daring to look back. When I finally reached it and locked the doors, I glanced toward the school. She was standing in the window of the art room, watching me. Her face was pressed against the glass, her breath fogging up the pain. And then she smiled. I drove home that night in complete silence, the radio off, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they ached. I didn't tell anyone what happened, partly because I didn't think they'd believe me, and partly because I didn't want to relive it. The next day at school, I avoided the art room altogether. But during lunch, I overheard some teachers talking about how one of the side doors had been left wide open overnight, letting in snow. They laughed it off, blaming a forgetful janitor. I know better. And to this day, I still can't explain who or what that girl was. It was one of those bitterly cold winter nights, the kind where the wind howls through the trees and ice clings to every surface like an unwelcome guest. I was driving back home from a late shift, exhausted and eager to be in the warmth of my tiny, well-worn apartment. The road stretched ahead of me, dark and empty, flanked by snow-covered pines. My old sedan rattled slightly as it hit patches of ice, but I knew these roads well. Too well, in fact. It wasn't until I passed the old half-collapsed barn about 10 miles out of town that I noticed the truck. Its headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, bright and too close for comfort. At first, I thought it was just another driver in a hurry to get home, but as I kept my speed steady, the truck matched me. If I sped up, it sped up. If I slowed down, it did too. Great, I muttered under my breath. The truck was old, the kind with a loud engine that rumbled through the night air. Its headlights seemed to bore into the back of my skull, casting long, eerie shadows across my dashboard. I flicked on my turn signal and pulled over slightly, hoping the driver would pass. But they didn't. The truck lingered, crawling alongside me for a few agonizing seconds before falling back again. That's when I felt the first sliver of unease. Something about the way the driver stayed behind me felt wrong. Maybe it was the isolation of the road or the oppressive silence of the snow-covered landscape, but a knot tightened in my stomach. I told myself not to panic. Maybe they were just messing around, some bored local looking for cheap thrills. But as the minutes dragged on, their persistence became unnerving. They flashed their high beams suddenly, blinding me for a moment. My heart jumped and I instinctively swerved slightly before regaining control. "What the hell?" I hissed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield despite the heater's weak efforts to keep the car warm. The truck's lights dimmed again, but now it was closer. Too close. I could see the shadowy figure of the driver behind the wheel, but no details. My brain screamed at me to keep calm, but my pulse was pounding in my ears. I reached for my phone, only to remember it was sitting dead in the cup holder. Typical. The road ahead forked, one route leading toward a shortcut through the woods, and the other keeping to the main highway. I debated for a split second before veering onto the shortcut. It was narrower and less maintained, but it was my best chance to lose this psycho. The truck followed. Of course it did. The trees closed in on either side, their branches heavy with snow, creating a tunnel that felt suffocating. The truck's headlights flickered through the gaps, casting strange patterns on the road ahead. I pushed the gas pedal harder, the car protesting with every bump and skid. The truck matched my speed effortlessly, its engine roaring like some predator hunting its prey. Then, it happened. A loud bang echoed through the night as something struck the back of my car. The impact wasn't enough to send me off the road, but it rattled me to my core. They were ramming me. Panic surged, and I slammed the accelerator. The car lurched forward, skidding slightly, but I managed to keep it on the road. My eyes darted to the mirror, catching a glimpse of something even more unsettling. The driver was waving at me. Not an angry wave, but a slow, deliberate one, as if they were enjoying this sick game. I wanted to scream, to pull over and confront them, but every instinct told me that would be a mistake. Instead, I focused on the road, desperate to put distance between us. The truck rammed me again, harder this time. My car fishtailed and I fought the wheel to stay on course. The shortcuts, sharp turns, and icy patches didn't make it easy, and then, as suddenly as it had started, the truck backed off. Its headlights disappeared, swallowed by the darkness behind me. I didn't dare slow down. My hands were shaking, my chest heaving, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. The shortcut eventually reconnected to the highway, and I breathed a sigh of relief as I saw the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. Civilization. Safety. I slowed to a more reasonable speed, still checking my mirrors obsessively. The truck was gone, or so I thought. Just as I reached the outskirts of town, I spotted it again, parked on the shoulder, engine idling. This time I got a better look at the driver. He was grinning, a wild, unhinged grin that made my skin crawl. He tipped his hat at me before pulling back onto the road and driving in the opposite direction, disappearing into the night. I made it home without any more incidents, but I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made me jump. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I saw a truck similar to that one, my stomach turned. Hi, my name is Sean, and I'm about to tell you about the most horrifying night of my life. I swear every detail I'm about to share is true, and if you've ever been alone in a snowstorm, maybe you'll understand why this memory still haunts me. It was the dead of winter, mid-January, and I had just rented this tiny cabin in the Rockies for a weekend getaway. I needed to unplug, you know? No Wi-Fi, no phone calls, just me, the snow, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read for months. The first day was perfect. Crisp air, snow-covered trees, and total silence except for the crunch of my boots in the snow. By the time evening rolled around, I had a roaring fire going and felt like I was in some cozy snow globe. But then the storm hit. I had heard something about a blizzard on the weather report, but I thought it would pass overnight. Instead, the wind started howling like a pack of wolves. I'm not exaggerating when I say it felt like the whole cabin was shaking. The windows rattled and the snow piled up so fast that when I peeked outside, the porch steps were completely buried. Still, I wasn't too worried. I had supplies and the fireplace kept things warm. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed, figuring the storm would blow over by morning. But then, the knocking started. At first, I thought it was a tree branch tapping against the side of the cabin. But it wasn't random. It was rhythmic. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. My stomach dropped. No one else was supposed to be out here. The nearest cabin was over a mile away, and with the storm raging, who the hell would be wandering around in this weather? I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept to the front door. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it over the wind. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" No answer, just the sound of the wind whipping snow against the windows. I stood there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, until the knocking started again, louder this time. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 3 more. I'm not proud of this, but I froze. I didn't want to open the door, but I also couldn't just ignore it. Finally, I forced myself to unlock it and crack it open. The cold hit me like a slap to the face. My flashlight beam cut through the snow, but there was no one there. Just an endless sea of white. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. My brain was scrambling for explanations. Maybe it was just a branch. Or maybe someone had been there but ran off. Either way, I wasn't going back to bed. I sat by the fire, trying to calm down, when I heard it again. Not knocking this time, but scratching. It was faint, coming from the back of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight again and made my way to the back window. I stood there for what felt like forever, straining to hear over the storm. That's when I saw it. A shadow, tall, human-shaped, but wrong. It was standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the snow. I froze. My breath fogged up the glass as I stared, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. Then it moved. Not towards the cabin, but sideways, circling. It was slow, deliberate, like it wanted me to know it was there. At this point, every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to do something. But what? I was snowed in, alone, with nowhere to run. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the fire poker and sat in the middle of the room, where I could see all the doors and windows. I stayed there for hours, the fire crackling behind me, clutching that stupid poker like it would do anything against whatever was out there. The scratching came and went, sometimes at the windows, sometimes at the walls. Around 3 a.m., the storm started to die down, and with it, the noises stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to close my eyes. When the sun finally came up, I mustered the courage to go outside. The snow was blinding, but I had to see if there were footprints. If there had been some deranged person messing with me, I wanted proof. But when I got outside, there was nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, just pristine, untouched snow. I packed up and left that morning, cutting my weekend short. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing something was out there, and realizing it had never left any trace. So yeah, if you ever think about renting a cabin in the middle of nowhere during winter, maybe don't, or at least don't go alone.